but we're going to record anyway. We can upload it later if we need to.
Yeah. This is very responsive to messages.
Yeah, we try to be,
Yeah. For evidence-based counseling solutions, it says they are incredibly responsive.
Oh, so you got to take it one step further.
Yeah, incredibly.
So for those of you who don't know, we also have a kind of, I guess it's a sister brother company kind of thing going on, and we are doing also evidence-based counseling solutions. So if you know anybody that's just kind of having a hard time, might need somebody to talk to, we're here for you for that, and we can get you set up. Dr. Hoke's going to be heading that up, and should be good to go. There's Katie, and
Hi,
I
guys.
obviously didn't get the memo on the black shirt. Ted got it. I didn't get it.
Oh, it's just always a given.
Yeah, always.
Duh.
It was really dreary outside here. I was all pumped for this. I think I've got the Facebook things figured out.
Cool.
Who knows? We'll see. There was technology involved. So for those of you who have been attending our webinar libraries, it's going to run a little bit different. This really isn't a professional development, and so much it is just the three of us wanting to get together and chat and talk, and but we thought we'd talk about relative subjects, and hope to kind of continue this out through the summer and hit some topics that maybe expand on what we've talked about in our learning libraries, give you guys opportunities to ask questions if you have any. We can talk about that, but I think our overall goal is to try to stay on one topic, but we all know how that works out when we all get together. So yeah, we were going to start today with ABA in the public schools, and I asked the question, can it be done? I mean, it seems kind of like a spoiler alert. I feel like we should say that, yes, it can, and yes, we do, and yes, you probably do on a regular basis. Katie, have you seen ABA in the public schools?
Never. Of course. Yes. Yes, I have.
Yeah, and then Ted, you've been around for a while.
I'm old.
Yeah, you are old. People keep comparing you and I generationally, and I have to keep reminding them that we are separated by, I think, a generation.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've been around since since Watson?
No, Sessionov, Pavlov.
Okay. Fair enough.
Yeah.
So just, I guess one of the things to just start thinking about is, why do you guys think that ABA people think that you can't do it? I mean, because if people just readily thought you could, we probably wouldn't have private day schools the way we do. Because definitely what parents are seeking a lot of times out of private day schools. So what do you guys think that is the biggest thing that is seen as a barrier?
Are you asking us? Or
Yeah, I'm curious about your opinion. I mean,
Okay, behavior analysis is just good teaching. What it is just arranging stuff so that people do stuff that they couldn't do before, or do differently than they did before, or do better than they did before, do less of some things, do more of other things, do some things faster, slower, differently. It's just good teaching. And, the principles exist. They're basic laws in nature, like gravity and like all of that stuff. And it exists, and it's going on whether you know it or not. I work for a school of education. I work for a department of special education. And not in my department, of course, but I can tell you that there's a lot of fads out there. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of stuff that teachers get taught that has very little to do with how to teach. And the way behavior analysis is presented, really starting with a lot of introductory psychology texts and then going on, is just incorrect. It's like coming to me to learn how to do auto mechanics. Bad idea. Yeah. If you want to learn behavior analysis, go to a behavior analyst. If you want to learn auto mechanics, go to an auto mechanic. And there's just a lot of stuff taught that's wrong. And there are a lot of fads. And frankly, to do behavior analysis really well, it requires that you be kind of intentional, and that you're able to let go of your whole ego, and that it's just kind of constantly testing the procedures. And a lot of people don't like that.
Yeah. And Katie, you kind of had an interesting experience coming into classroom teaching, right? I mean, because you came in as a supervised BCBA candidate. So you're already working on your BCBA coursework when you had your first classroom to teach in, right?
Yeah, so I was just really lucky that way. I think to go back to the barriers thing, I think the biggest barrier is that training, honestly. I was lucky enough to enter into teaching with that foundational knowledge and the direction and the resources. A lot of teachers are not, and it's not their fault. I think that's the biggest barrier. I think we keep kids in public schools using ABA through training and experience. So
yeah. And what teachers are often taught, and I know this because it's part of the curriculum that teachers get to become teachers here in Virginia, is one course that is classroom management. Behavior analysis is considered classroom management and positive behavior support. And positive behavior support is not behavior analysis.
Yeah.
It's like first aid is not medicine. First aid is first aid and medicine is medicine. Behavior analysis is a whole science. And positive behavior support is like the first aid of behavior analysis, but with a lot of politics thrown in.
A lot of it. Yeah. And it's interesting because the PBIS usually gets misrepresented with ABA.
Yeah.
And the lack of success that a lot of PBIS programs have get dragged down kind of the impression of ABA, I feel like.
Yeah, I think it's just confusing. I think teachers get a lot of input from a lot of meetings and a lot of places and a lot of other professional developments, and it's a lot to sift through, especially if you're new.
Yeah.
So I think that if we streamline ABA in public schools with the right amount of training and the right amount of collaboration, then I think things will be a lot smoother.
Yeah. Well, it's also the case that, it's considered that there's academics and there's behavior. Mm-hmm. And the behavior is the problem behavior. But behavior is anything you say, do, think, or feel. If it's a verb, it's behavior. So reading is behavior. Doing math is behavior. Spelling is behavior. Writing is behavior. Thinking is behavior. Problem solving is behavior. All this stuff is behavior, but it's never considered as behavior. And so people are taught a whole lot of fad things and a whole lot of less than optimal things to accomplish that stuff. But if we approach it the same way we approach any other behavior, things go really well, if you know what you're doing.
Yeah. And that word behavior, I think, is one of the things that really hamstrings us as we do kind of enter into the public schools, because people think we're the behavior police. People think that we're there to deal with the problem behavior, when in fact, what we're there to deal with is changing the way instruction is so that the problem behavior doesn't occur.
Yeah, ideally, we're not just rolling in when, there's a kid throwing chairs and climbing on furniture. Ideally, we're there in the antecedent kind of condition, and we're there to help teach you how to embed ABA into your instruction, so that you're not having kids climb on furniture and throwing chairs.
So when we work with new teachers, one of the things we hear a lot about, and this is, I think, absolutely true, and Ted, you just kind of touched on it a minute ago, is everybody goes to college to be a teacher, right? I mean, that's a done thing. It's required. But the feedback I get back from a lot of teachers is no one ever taught me what to do when a kid throws a chair at me, which is an interesting perspective, because what we want to teach you to do is where that kid never has a reason to throw a chair at you, right? Like we don't want to just teach you a consequence-based intervention that is after the child has thrown the chair at you, because if that's happened, then something's probably gone awry way before the kid actually picked up the chair and threw it at you. But I think that training component, like Katie was saying, is such a big deal. And that ties back in, Ted, to what you were talking about, that, there is one source to really get ABA done well, and that's BCBAs. Now, that being said, just like any profession, and I'll voice this. I mean, just like any profession, there are good teachers, there are bad teachers, there are good lawyers, there are bad lawyers. There's doctors that you want to have cut you open. There's doctors that you probably don't want to have cut you open. And there's good BCBAs and bad BCBAs. I mean, we would hope that professionally, our peers would all be kind of the same mind. But the reality is, when we start talking about coming into the public schools, it is such a different environment than what a lot of BCBAs are used to working in, which is one thing that makes us very unique here at EBCS, is that we do have that background in teaching. So we look at things a little bit differently, and how our science can be applied in the classroom. I think for me, the one thing I always want to try to emphasize is that we want to teach, and whether that is a behavior of doing math, reading, writing, sitting appropriately, transitioning appropriately, communicating appropriately, all that falls under our scope. And so I think one of the biggest barriers is being limited by perception of ABA being this very clinical, small thing, when in fact it's a pretty big science, right, Ted?
It's a huge science. It's relevant in any endeavor in which human behavior or animal behavior is important.
Yeah.
So if you go to the Association for Behavior Analysis website and look at all the special interest groups, yeah, there's behavior analysis in education, and there's verbal behavior, and there's criminology, there's sexual behavior, there's all sorts of stuff. You name it. There's organizational behavior management, which deals entirely with business and industry. And it's an incredibly successful, incredibly lucrative field. Maybe we're barking up the wrong tree here. But the thing is, you mentioned embedding ABA in the classroom. The fact is, it's already going on, but people aren't aware of it. Kind of like gravity is always going on, whether we're aware of it or not. And so it kind of behooves one to actually pay attention to how things are set up, how things are arranged, how things are done, so you could do it better to better serve your student, and thereby better serve yourself. When you have students who are actively engaged in instruction and actively doing their stuff and being successful, they're far less likely to throw that chair at your head. So it's a win-win.
Yeah, I think we've all seen that, so okay, so let's just deal with kind of a myth, right? ABA is only for autism. Is that true? I mean, that's what a lot of people think. I mean,
when I started, I was managing, when I started in behavior analysis, I was managing an after-school tutoring program for the lowest income kids in the inner city in Milwaukee. None of them had autism. From there, I worked in a group home for adults with intellectual disabilities. None of them had autism. A couple years later, I was the only behavior analyst in a psychiatric hospital. And my patients were chronic schizophrenics and murderers and rapists, and none of them had autism. From there, I managed the inpatient pediatric feeding disorders program at Johns Hopkins, where I taught non-organic failure to thrive babies how to eat. None of them had autism. And, it was years later that I learned that this stuff was being applied with kids with autism. I thought, I never knew you could do that. And yet it's become such a big industry that that's what people equate it with. And I don't get it, because it's going on around us, with us all the time. And we don't even realize it.
Yeah. For those of you here on the chat, I mean, when you think of ABA, do you naturally associate it with autism? Just kind of a yes or no in the chat window there. Whenever I'm talking to different SPED directors and initially kind of introducing ourselves, the first thing they want to talk about is their autism programs. But what's interesting, and Katie's kind of experienced this in a couple divisions that we've been in, that once we're there, we really get pulled towards the emotional disabilities, even the general education settings. And when we look at the behaviors that are in pre-K and kindergarten right now, and that schools are struggling with, that usually is just gen ed kids, neurotypically developing kids without a disability, that are having these extreme behaviors in the classroom, and everybody's kind of scratching their heads, wondering what to do next, because it's not always predictable, but generally speaking, once a kid realizes that they can get out of work by by spitting or hitting or doing something, they're going to keep doing that if it's continually reinforced. We got somebody that said yes. And this is a little bit confusing, Kate. I don't know if you're on whenever Cammie signed on. Cammie is operating under a alias today as Bennett Wells.
Oh, fun.
Flying under the radar, kind of like
I like the espionage.
yeah. What did Ben Franklin write under? Was it like Cy
I
Dude?
can't remember.
Cy Do Good or something? It was in National Treasure. Great movie. Yeah.
Love National.
So, but you say we have 2 ABA classes at my school. I think all of their students are autistic. And, there's a reality in special education that autism has become this very broad diagnosis anyway. But I think if anything represents the benefit of ABA more than, well, that's a lot of anythings in one sentence, I guess. But if you can sum up the benefits of ABA, is that the diagnostics doesn't really matter because we just deal with the behavior and how it occurs in that specific environment. A lot of times, as a matter of fact, this happened yesterday. We were working with a student online, and the mother was saying she couldn't tell which disability category to assign this behavior to that behavior. And I was explaining to her, you know what, the great thing is for us, it just doesn't matter.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't matter whether it's an intellectual disability or autism. It doesn't matter whether it's an emotional disability. I mean, there's certain things that factor in, like we factor in cognition and developmental levels and things like that. But we're just going to deal with the behavior, how it manifests itself in that environment. So I think that's what makes us successful. Okay, I mean, your classroom, your last one, I think back on the kids that were in it, and you had
that
like
range. I had a very wide range of.
huge range, yeah. It was classified as an autism classroom.
Yeah, there's low functioning all the way to like just ED. Yeah. Yeah, and so, but luckily ABA does apply to everybody, so I could set up my room how I needed to in order to serve all the kids. But it definitely is a challenge, and we definitely don't just work in autism rooms, and even within autism rooms, like there's going to be kids in there who have diagnoses that are just that they don't seem like they have your typical autism. It's such a huge spectrum. It's so vague that it doesn't really matter. Yeah.
So I feel like we talk about ourselves a lot as BCBAs. I mean, we're kind of known to have a slight bit of arrogance. Although Ted, I got to tell you, is probably one of the most intelligent people that I've ever met, and he's the most humble person you'll ever meet.
The more you know, the more you know you don't know. And you don't know.
Well, that's I constantly feel like
what drives me nuts is these brand new 23 and 24-year-old BCBAs who act like they know it all. They read the white book. The white book is one of the worst books in the world. I hate the white book. And, it's just
called the ABA Bible. What?
No, it's not. Yeah, well, and some people make behavior analysis their religion, which is such
That's true.
Mistake.
Very true.
No, I think, what it is, again, what behavior analysis does is take the blame and take the focus off of the people involved and puts it all on the procedures that are in place. Mm-hmm. And so you never have to feel guilty about making a mistake. You never have to feel guilty about doing things wrong, because frankly, we're all just figuring it out.
Yeah.
And if the emphasis is on testing the procedures, I'm not a bad teacher. I did a procedure that wasn't as effective as it could be, so I changed the procedure. When you're able to let go of that nonsense, that ego, then you're able to just look at the procedures and evaluate the procedures as you're going along. And that really takes you a long way. But those new BCBAs aren't so much about that. They're about having that title.
Yes.
It's all I want.
Everybody's excited to have those letters after your name. But that's a really good component of a barrier, I think. And of course, Kay, you and I just do this on a day in, day out basis where we go into classrooms and we'll be called in to consult on a kid. It's sometimes easier to focus the problem on the child and say, well, I can't because I can't teach because because of these behaviors. And I think one of the pushbacks we get when we go into the classrooms is all of a sudden we shift that focus and start to say, well, yeah, we can, and here's some ways that we can do it. And I think that in some ways feels like we don't empathize with what the teachers are going through. Certainly you and I, having run these classrooms and taught day in, day out in them, we know we know what it's like when, you know, you constantly have kids scratching and hitting at you and yelling at you and running away from you. And
yeah, I think it's a perspective shift that takes time. I think that pushback is a lot of the times it's just anytime you have to change the way you're thinking or looking at something, you know, it hurts your brain. Like, it's like, how? So I think that it really is just a perspective thing, and that it takes time, and that we're here to help make that transition so that you can see the light.
Yeah.
so you can see the progress, and so you can feel confident in doing the procedures that you already have been doing, just a little differently. Because most of the time, like Ted said, teachers are already using ABA. They just don't know necessarily the why or they need to tweak a couple things. So
Ted, have you ever heard a teacher tell you, I don't have time to do what you're telling me to do? Have you ever heard that?
No, and I sympathize. I say, yeah, you're busy. You're dealing with all this stuff. And I also point out, and you're already spending a lot of time dealing with the behavior, you know? So it may be a little more upfront, but it's going to pay off on the back end.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. I mean, again, it's kind of that initial, just like with some of the kids that we have, there's a honeymoon period. So when ABA does come into a classroom, you may have this honeymoon period where we're kind of dealing with some of the more high intensity behaviors, de-escalating things, but then the focus switches and we're all of a sudden trying to coach, model, have you do things in the classroom. And that can be a little frustrating because we are looking for you to change what you're doing a little bit. And it can seem like more work, but the reality is, and at least in my experience, that you end up saving time in the long run. I mean, I've had conversations with teachers that tell me, well, I don't have time to go walk past him like every 2 minutes, put my hand on his shoulder and pat his shoulder to kind of make sure he's under a schedule of reinforcement. But then I'll go in and do a data collection, and the teacher's spending in an hour's time 40 minutes of kind of engaging the problem behavior, right? So it is a shift of perspective.
I think it's a trust thing. I think we kind of have to show, not just tell you. And so I think that we do a good job of that. I think that, you know, we're not just going to give you a suggestion and say peace. Like we want to show you it's all about it being sustained throughout the year and you being able to use it across all of your students. So I think that trust in that perspective change comes with some trust. So we do want to show you that it works before we expect you to just do it.
But when I go into a classroom, you know, for the first time and then every time thereafter, you know, after I introduce myself and everything, my first question is, what can I help you with today? What do you want me to pay attention to today? What do you want me to work on today? Because I think initially it has to be something, and I don't mean this in a bad way or anything, but it has to be something that makes the teacher's life easier.
Yeah.
It has to be something that benefits the teacher. And of course, in benefiting, it's not going to be like going and getting the teacher a latte.
It's got to also benefit the kids.
Great reinforcement's always Starbucks, right?
It's going to
I'll
be
just bring you Starbucks.
that benefits the teacher by benefiting one or more of the students. And, you know, I think, and that's how I do things personally. And I think the three of us do things kind of similarly. What drives me nuts is, again, these brand new 23 and 24-year-old behavior analysts who go into a classroom and observe, and they say, okay, do this and this and this and this. And that's it. I'm thinking, wait a second. One, you know, you're like, shouldn't you be like interacting with the students too? Shouldn't you be doing something? Shouldn't you be trying stuff out before you hand it over? And two, again, that just kills any potential for trust, and it kills any potential for collaboration, because you're not helping. What you're doing is bossing. You're telling someone to do something. Yeah. And frankly, teachers already get enough of that. Yeah. You know, I go in there to make life better for the teachers and the students. I want it to be, when I walk in that classroom, life gets better for people. Not when I walk in that classroom, you're going to get a list of things to do.
Yeah, outcome is definitely everything in that regard. I mean, so kind of shifting back to that barrier mindset and those new BCBAs coming in and kind of meeting that expectation of ABA only being low-VOS and discrete trial and sitting knee to knee and just pumping Skittles into a kid. I think that is a lot of people's association with ABA. I know when I've come into classrooms, that's kind of the kind of cringe I've gotten sometimes, that they see it as this very kind of robotic training process that we do, which honestly, my understanding of the science is that's the farthest thing from it. I mean, we're trying to work to the most natural, spontaneous behaviors that can occur. And if you're only staying in that discrete trial mode where you're sitting knee to knee constantly and just having to prompt, you're really not being successful at it. And I think where I've seen ABA kind of fail in the school environment is teachers, and it's a training thing. It's having access to those BCBAs, not being able to move past just that discrete trial or move past and through the prompt fading that needs to happen. Unfortunately, when we get to a lot of students, they've already kind of got this learned condition where they're so prompt dependent and they're so reinforcer dependent because no one's ever kind of helped the teacher plan out a way to fade those things and move to more naturally occurring behavior. So,
yeah. But, I have a friend who I previously worked for a large school system up here in Northern Virginia. And I was already board certified behavior analyst, already had my doctoral degree for like 20 years at the time. Already had a lot of licenses, already doing a lot of stuff. And because of the position I was in, I had to go through their applied behavior analysis training, which lasted 1 week before school began. And in that 1 week, what we learned was discrete trial training and what they called teaching interactions, which is behavioral skills training. And we were told that this is behavior analysis, and this is all that there is of behavior analysis, and this is what we expect you to do. And so, a lot of school systems, not a lot, but some come up with their own brand of behavior analysis, which is kind of like coming up with your own brand of chemistry or your own brand of biology, your own brand of physics. It's not how nature works. The other thing is relevant to something else you were saying, Chad, about this just being discrete trial. So sometimes it ends up being that way because that's all people are exposed to. The other thing, I have a friend who's a behavior analyst who trains horses, dogs, Olympic gymnasts, the guys on, what's that fishing show, The Most Dangerous Catch or something like that?
Deadliest Catch.
Deadliest Catch, yes.
Yeah, with the crab, yeah.
She works with that crew. She trains surgeons. She trains neurosurgeons and cardiothoracic surgeons. And she's a behavior analyst. And you can bet that those surgeons aren't sitting there doing discrete trial training, 10 trials of the same thing. And the Deadliest Catch guys aren't. And the horses aren't. And maybe the gymnasts are. I don't know. But there's a whole world out there of stuff that's behavior analysis. It's not just this one thing. And so somehow people get taught that it is, and it stinks that they're being taught the wrong thing.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the biggest frustrations that I have is walking into those preconceived notions and having to change them.
I think a lot of people think we're just going to stand in the corner and take data. And sometimes we do have to do that for short periods of time, but we're going to tell you. And we would never, if there is a safety risk or a behavior that is severe, we're definitely going to step in. We're not going to
if you're not going to step in and help, then just get out of there because you're just complicating things.
Yeah. And I especially this year, and I guess it's because we're, with the company and the formation of everything, we're in more schools and more school divisions. But one of the things that's been driving the perception of what ABA are these outside kind of in-home ABA support mechanisms coming into the school, which I mean, in my mind, it's just bad for the schools. It's not appropriate. It's not ABA. Everything I've seen being done is as far from ABA as you can get. But the reality is, and Ted, whether we like it or not, the minute that the state passed the laws requiring insurance to pay for ABA therapy, it became a bit of a money grab for some people. I mean, there definitely is a huge market for it. And if any of you know about
the law was, it was an interesting thing because it was worked on for several years by lobbyists of several autism groups, autism parent groups. And so what it did was, and this took me by surprise, I was in China at the time, actually, when I learned about this, when an email went out saying that licensure is going to happen. And what the governor did at the time, Governor O'Donnell, was there was the bill that was sent to him by our legislature about licensing behavior analysts and requiring that insurance pay for behavior analysis services for kids with autism. So it was limited to just that one population. But then what the governor did was wrote into it himself before he signed it that they're licensed by the Board of Medicine. Board of Medicine had, you know, that was a surprise to them too. You know, so it took them a while. I chaired the working group for Board of Medicine that wrote the licensure regs. And they were all, what? Why us? You know, what do we do? Why do we have to do this? But they got it done. But, you know, part of that perception is there because of that law, because it requires insurance reimbursement for behavior analysis services only for people with autism in Virginia, not for anyone else, which is kind of sad because, you know, I work with people with post-traumatic stress disorder. I work with people with anxiety disorders. I work with people with depression. The number one thing that helps people with depression is behavioral activation. Who does that better than us? You know, with PTSD, it's prolonged exposure, which is a combination of respondent extinction, which is a big word, and verbal mediation, which is a lot of verbal behavior. Who does that better than us? And yet the insurance doesn't have to pay for it. And so you end up having to get a bunch of different licenses like me.
But they look so good on your wall though, Ted.
Yeah, but I'd rather have a nice Miro or Warhol or something.
Yeah, that'd be nice.
Yeah. So what there's kind of been a cause and effect to that though too, because what's happened is as the federal government and as state governments have said insurance need to pay for ABA for autism, and what is very true about it and what a lot of parents don't understand is that they can't pay for academic interventions of autism. So it does fall back on the school as far as like what the students are working on. Medicaid won't reimburse for academic goals. They'll reimburse for functional life skill goals, which is an important distinction, especially as these people kind of trickle into the schools. But it's been really interesting since all this COVID started, and we've started as a company trying to train outside the state of Virginia, and we've had conversations with SPED directors all over the country, and it's been very kind of enlightening that everybody across the country is trying to figure out the same thing, which is my parents want ABA in the school. It costs a fortune for school divisions to send kids out to private day. How do we do that in the public schools? And one of the things that I always tell SPED directors to keep in mind is two things. One is it's not a matter of if ABA is going to come into schools. It's a matter of when on a full-time kind of basis and less consultative basis. And then the other thing is that if the school divisions don't define what ABA is going to look like in the schools, then the parents ultimately will and the advocates ultimately will. And I don't think that's a good thing for the schools. I don't think that's a good thing for the kids, because ABA in public schools needs to be tailored to the environment that it's occurring in, which again, that's kind of what we specialize in. We have that kind of background in education and in teaching, and we understand that. But my first, in one of the divisions that we work in, the first response that I got was, we don't want you here. We've seen BCBAs come into the classroom already. Mm-hmm. And what I found out was the people they were referring to, they weren't BCBAs. They weren't registered behavior technicians. They weren't even qualified mental health professionals. They were just behavior technicians that an in-home company was sending in with a kid to increase their billable hours for ABA. And I feel like we're constantly having to paint a picture of what ABA actually is. I think from a special ed standpoint, that one-to-one mindset is very contradictory to ABA. If a kid always has a one-to-one, they never generalize skills. If they always have a one-to-one, they never have to use skills.
If they have a one-to-one, they never learn how to learn from group instruction, whether it's small group or large group. They never learn how to behave in a movie theater or in a Sunday school class or in circle time or any of those things, because it's always one-to-one. And no one bothered to tell the whole rest of the world that for this kid, it has to be one-to-one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, Kate, I mean, do you have any experiences like that where we've kind of gone into classrooms and seen the restrictiveness of that one-to-one as far as development of a kid's skills?
I mean, yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, most schools there are one-to-ones, and it's usually those kids that have intense behaviors. But one experience I did have, which I was kind of surprised. The child, so it was middle school, and so the child actually was advocating for himself. It's like, I don't want a one-to-one. Like, he's able to say that. He was doing well. And so I think even if we do have one-to-ones in elementary school or in a certain grade, like, we definitely need to plan to fade it back. I think that's huge, especially if the child is just asking for it nicely. Like, can I go to this class by myself? So I was like, yes, like I say, we definitely try that. And it's interesting. A lot of the teachers sometimes have pushback against that. And I think it's just because, again, it's that perspective thing. It's how something's been done. It may have been successful in some ways, but I think that it can limit the child. So it's a case by case thing, but I think we should definitely be pushing for that generalization and pushing for that child to be able to be as independent as possible. I think it's a disservice if we don't push for that. So
I've worked in a classroom recently in which there are about 12 students. There's one teacher, there's one instructional assistant, and there were 6 one-to-ones. And they're not school employees, they come from a private agency, but they're not allowed to do anything except intervene if there's a problem behavior. And the teacher does such a great job, and the IA, the problem behaviors are few and far between. The teacher and IA get it. They're testing their procedures. They get it. And they figure stuff out, and they adjust as they go along. And so what you're left with in this classroom is 8 adults, 12 kids. 2 of the adults are working all day. The other 6 are playing on their phones. And don't you wish, if there has to be a one-on-one, if the one-on-one could do something that enhances the instruction for the child? If the one-on-one could do something that gives this kid something extra, that either helps catch up for stuff that he's gotten behind on, or helps move him ahead, or does something. But all too often, the one-on-ones are there just to handle problem behavior. And sometimes you get very little of it.
Yeah, and again, trying to cycle all this back to kind of barriers to ABA, I find one-to-one written into an IEP a barrier to ABA, because once it's written into the IEP, it has to be provided. But when we come in and we start working with the kid, we're looking at ways to create independence. And
yeah, I think that's an important point. We're not just saying, get rid of the one-on-ones and let them roam free. Like, we understand that, especially if it's gen ed, special ed, we know you have a lot of kids, and we know that managing all of those kids and one or more big behavior problems is not easy. And so if we're suggesting you not do the whole one-on-one thing, we're going to give you, we want to give you the tools to manage it without that. So just to be clear, we're not saying it's fine. Like, we know that that's stressful, and not having that extra set of hands and eyes isn't valuable. I think it just has to be utilized in the right way. Like Ted was saying, like, what are they actually doing? There needs to be a plan. And that's where we would come in.
Yeah, and having there's a difference between teaching skills and doing skills for a child. And a lot of the times when you look at how instructional assistants or paraprofessionals, however you refer to them, even PCAs sometimes, personal care assistants, how they interact with students, they're not teaching skills. They're doing for the kids so they don't ever have to use those skills. And that's just not life, and that's not getting the student anywhere. So
yeah, my first experience was as an IA. My very like fresh out of college, I was an IA, and I worked for an incredible teacher, and I was hired as a one-on-one actually. So, and it got to the point where the teacher, after the first couple weeks, she pulled me aside. She's like, "You don't have to baby her. You need to let her do things." I'm like, "Oh, I just thought I was supposed to." And so there's that lack of communication, that lack of training, and the light bulb started going off. And I was lucky enough to have a teacher to recognize that, even with everything else that was going on, and training me to foster that independence. It's part of your job, especially as a special education teacher. That's not necessarily taught in college when you go to school for it. So it's an experience thing. But yeah, so like it was my instinct as a helper, as a caregiver, as someone who wants to do good to help, but you have to think about how that is affecting the child.
Yeah, the focus needs to be on the learning process and not the product. It's kind of like when your kid, and Katie, this isn't you yet, but Chad and I have been there. When your kid's in preschool, you want the kid to bring home the most amateurish looking project that they made in school.
Yeah.
Not the perfect one. when it's the really amateurish looking, thing,
it's theirs.
The kid made it. The kid did it. The kid learned something. When it's perfect, that there was an adult either doing the work for the child or hand over hand or in some other way getting the child to do it. Child didn't learn a whole lot there. Learning is a process, and we got to focus on that and give a lot less attention to the product.
Yeah. So while we got about 15 more minutes, feel free to throw some questions into the chat if you want to. We certainly can always think about things to keep talking about. But one of the things I'd like you to throw in the chat is one or two words that come to mind when you think of ABA, just what you associate with applied behavior analysis. In the past, probably really in the past 5 years, it started about 10 years ago, you started to see more and more legal action in regards to parents suing public school divisions for applied behavior analysis. But you also started to see a lot of legal action on situations that involve restraint and seclusion. There's that really big one that out West Virginia recently. It's something that is just being driven into the public schools. And I think that we do a webinar on collaborative practice and talking about some of the barriers that exist with it. But the truth is that when we walk into a public school as a BCBA, we are definitely outnumbered, right? There's so many more teachers. Teachers have been teaching for a lot longer than ABA has been going into public schools. There's other specialists that are working with students with autism and different disabilities, speech pathologists, occupational therapists, and we've got to kind of negotiate all those landmines of making sure that we're able to work with everyone and not against them. But that being said, there also has to be that, I'm going to try to use a big word, I hope it's right, reciprocity, right? Where they're willing to work with us as well. And it just depends on the school and depends on the division. I've had issues with, with occupational therapy. I've had issues with speech pathology being real kind of walls to working with the student. Katie, I think about the student that we work with kind of on a regular basis right now. And in his home, he has a crash pad, which is this big, fluffy, I'm sure there's some OTs out there, big, fluffy thing that he can go and just crash on. And what he's been taught is that was a need. And whenever he needed that, he could stop whatever he was doing. He could remove himself from whatever task demand he was being placed in and go. And it was to serve that need. And that is very contradictory to how we kind of develop instruction. And if that student always has that option, that's not a good thing. Another example is a classroom that I worked in this year, and I went in to do data collection for an FBA. And the first thing the teacher told me was every time she puts an assignment in front of this kid, he goes and he sits on the couch. And the first words out of my mouth was, why is there a couch in the classroom? I mean, if I was a kid or even a functioning adult, I would want to sit on the couch instead of at the desk.
I think that's another part of the whole perspective thing. Like you see on Pinterest, all these pictures of like these classrooms with couches and teepees and like calm spots are the coziest, coolest looking spots. It's like, I want to be in that spot. I want to go over there. And the kids are definitely going to go over there. And so it's hard when you're getting bombarded with all these images of how things could be and it'd be perfect and it would be helping. And then we come in and we're like, well, behaviorally.
Let's Marie Kondo this.
Yes, does it bring me joy?
TP's nice. Let's put it on the playground.
Yeah, or if it's in their room at home, like cool. Yeah. TP's rule. My niece has one. I love it. So, and I think that's where that collaborative thing comes in. So if an OT has suggested a crash pad, I mean, it'd be really nice as all the professionals working with a kid come together and, that perception thing. I mean, my mom's a speech therapist. So when I told her what I was doing, she's like, oh, because she's had a bad experience. She's like, yeah, they just came in and worked one-on-one with one of my students and then left and that was it. It's like, yeah, it's not what we're after here. We want to collaborate. And so she's been really interested in the collaborative piece that we practice and talk about. But it's really important that we're all communicating to serve the same child. It's hugely important that consistency is everything. So.
Yeah, and be willing to kind of rethink what we're doing too. I mean, one of the things that makes, just ethically as BCBA is we can only recommend things that are evidence-based, that have been proven out, and both in the experimental environment and the natural environment. And it's never something that we're just arbitrarily referring to. And I don't think that there is always that fidelity with a lot of things that have been established for a long time in the schools. I look at a lot of things that are just kind of thrown at problems to prevent problem behavior from occurring, and not actually teaching the new behavior. I just I hate to cycle this around to autism, but there is this perception that with autism, what we need to do is just completely change any and all environments that individual is ever going to experience, and then we'll be good to go. Well, but that's not life, and that's not a very inclusive life for sure. I think that we need to teach students to tolerate and be successful in all environments. There's a quote that I usually put on one of the trains, and it came from one of the best documents I've ever read, an article on elopement and intervening in elopement behavior. And it talks about, and this is a very loosely quoted, what's the term for that? When you don't actually quote word for word.
Paraphrase.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much, people, for the assistance there. It talks about a BCBA's responsibility being to modify the environment rather than force an individual to tolerate an aversive environment. And that may be true where we start, but that's not definitely where we're ending. We may come in and make environmental changes on the very front end to start working on a behavior, but we're gradually going to fade back the environment to a more naturally governing contingencies, like what does occur in the natural setting. You've probably heard us say, we have this saying that, what does it look like when the kid's at Walmart, right? Yeah, we can change everything in that classroom. We can dim the lights and we can put crash pads in rooms and things. What does it look like when the kid's walking around in a building with a lot of stimuli, both visual, auditory, more other people around? And we want them to be successful in that too. One of the most ridiculous things that, if I can get on a soapbox, and I shared this really early on when we were doing the webinar series, is that Busch Gardens now If you go in at the very beginning of the day and show a doctor's note that you have ADHD, they'll give you a pass to not have to wait in line at any of the rides. And I think that
ADHD.
I know. I think you could diagnose us with it, so we can get our.
Yeah, I think we're all a little
our
on the
pass
spectrum.
pass,
I definitely have attention problems. I mean, you can tell we all do.
Yeah, and that's just contradictory to success, right? Like, I mean, we've got to teach the ability to tolerate different environments. It's not just about manipulating the environment so the kid never has to demonstrate behaviors. And
yeah, we want those kids to be able to stand, like if they want to go somewhere by themselves when they're older and stand in a line without having a hard time or a behavioral problem, like that's huge for independence. That's big for them.
Yeah. What happens if you have 8 kids with ADHD? They can't all be first.
Oh my God.
I know the one that you like the most, and
They all have a doctor's note that says they have to be first.
I'm so stressed. 8 kids with ADHD. Stay outside.
Yeah, and it's funny. Like one of the, Katie, I don't know if you've run into this, but I certainly have. Like I've got the reputation of walking in, just immediately engaging with the kid, throwing them up in the air.
I've been really trying hard to. That is my instinct. I don't know if that's been said after I left, but I've been trying not to, have that.
But that's what we start with the kids, right? Like
I try to explain it. Yeah, like I'm pairing with your kids so that I have instructional control and so that you can have instructional, I try to actually, map out the science so it doesn't look like I'm just like throwing your kids in the air.
Yeah. We actually, though, when it comes down to it, we probably are more, I don't want to say the word strict. Strict's probably not the word, but we will sit around and wait an hour, right, to reinforce something. We'll continue to be, make sure that contingency. Now we'll accept approximations of something that we're looking for sure. But we're going to make sure that we get kind of what we're targeting to get out of that student. And I always get a kick out of this perspective that we just come in and give the kids whatever they want. Well, that's not true. We give the kids what they want contingent on getting something that they need to demonstrate, not necessarily what we want, but something that they need as a skill. And that is a very significant difference. And again, it's that kind of perspective shift of what ABA is, and that just giving the Skittles, giving the cookies, giving the Skittles.
We're just throwing Skittles in your room and leaving.
Yeah, I suggested to a mom the other day that I really want to move away from the edible reinforcement, and the mom, it was funny because I felt like there was a little bit of pushback from it.
Well, that was just
the only way I can get him to do.
That was in the home also during COVID. Like we met in the schools.
In the school, but still the mindset that we're going to leave that reinforcement in place is usually still there.
Yeah. What does that look like when they're 16? Like
yeah, it looks pretty.
When they're 27. When it's young boys, I tell parents we're doing husband training. We're getting
home training.
To be a good husband.
Home training.
You don't want a wife to have to be throwing Skittles. You don't want him to have to run to the crash pad when it's time to take out the garbage. This is husband training.
I want a crash pad. Not doing the dishes. Yeah.
Ted, do you do marriage counseling? I can't remember.
I do.
Okay, well, there you go.
Actually,
if any of you need your husband's training, Ted.
Certificate in marriage and family therapy right there.
So if anybody needs any husband training, Ted is available for that.
I wasn't a very good one, but
Yeah. So I'm curious. I mean, does anybody? Only one person answered my question. Cammie, thank you so much for staying engaged with us, even though you're doing it under an assumed name. Discrete trials prior to this, and I'm glad we've kind of shifted your perspective with that. Discrete trial training, it's a great thing to teach a brand new skill that a kid has never experienced, but we're not going to stay there. We're definitely not going to stay there very long.
We do like discrete trial. We just want to move beyond it. Yeah.
It's just one of many tools.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So what are some of your questions? I mean, you guys have any questions about what ABA should look like in the schools? I mean, we're certainly opinionated enough to respond to that kind of question, but I think Katie early on in this presentation said something about how we come in and we model, we show, which is very different than coming in and just telling.
Yeah.
And it's something as a company we've tried to be very mindful of. It's one thing for us to come in and say, okay, you need to be doing this, and you need to change this, and you need to do this. It's another thing to actually show that it can work.
Yeah,
Now,
and there's also multiple ways that are evidence-based to go about something. So like how Chad might do something in the classroom might be different than how I would, even though they would be conceptually consistent in both work. So I think part of us showing you is to show that we're figuring out what works best in your classroom. We're not just saying this would work in a clinical setting, so it should work here. You know, we want to tailor it to what you're able to do, what you're capable, or what you're comfortable with doing. So I think that's huge. Yeah, we want to show you and you be comfortable with it. So
yeah, and there's tons of different ways to do it the right way.
Yeah.
It doesn't always have to look exactly the way we want it to look, which is kind of funny because when you think about school in general, school's pretty restrictive. Like we expect kids to do things in a very uniform way. There's these certain concepts of school, constructs of school that have lasted the test of time, and that's definitely one of them, right? So you got to be willing to accept those approximations, especially for those kids that are having challenging behavior. So, and this is a kind of a great comment to start to wrap up on. Cami says, how about a child who throws food and or chairs when she is upset? And my first response to you, Cami, is exactly why people get irritated with BCBAs, is that she's probably not just throwing them because she's upset. There's a function to the behavior, and the function's not upset. So is she throwing it because she wants to get out of doing something? Is she throwing it because she's trying to get your attention? Ted, you want to weigh in there a little bit, or?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. You got to figure out why it's happening. You got to address that why. And if it really is because she's upset, well, I've taught kids how to be upset the right way. I had one client who used to get fired from his work placements at school, his vocational rotations, because he'd swear and do all sorts of things when he didn't like the job he was doing. I had to teach him how to grumble the right way. It's a social skill. And what if throwing chairs and food is her social skill? Well, let's teach some other social skills and reinforce approximations. But before we get to that, let's figure out why it's happening.
Yeah, and I like that. We can have a whole webinar on how to teach people to grumble.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we all do it. We all have to control our faces and our feelings.
Quiet voice, only nice words, keep on working.
Yeah. So Cami, how about this, or Mr. Wells? Why don't on Thursday, because we're going to be doing these every Tuesdays and Thursdays for as long as people keep reinforcing us with their attention. Mm-hmm. I thought I was live streaming this, but I think it didn't work. I'm going to probably have to upload it. I need to do a little bit more research, but why don't you bring kind of a really good kind of breakdown of an example of what is going on before, during, and after when the child throws the food, and we'll kind of use that. But we're going to kind of continue to talk about some of the barriers to ABA this on Thursday, and mainly because Ted and I are doing a big presentation out in Idaho that is on this, and we're trying
not
to
actually out in Idaho.
Yeah, it was going to be
social distancing, guys.
Yeah,
I know, but we are adhering to the CDC.
So Ted, just so you know, I have been keeping really good notes. Like I've like things that have flowed into conversation here. So I think we'll be good. I got a good outline. I think we're stressing Audrey out, the Boise State people. But
what was it, that part where I asked, so what is it we're talking about again?
Yeah, that probably was not the best thing to bring up in that meeting, Ted.
Well, I got to be honest, I forgot. So we've been talking about this for 3 months.
Yeah, I've got it. I messaged Audrey right after that. So don't worry. He was just kidding.
I had to finish my tab, so.
It's important. Priorities.
It was busy.
So yeah, I mean, this is open to anyone and everyone. It's free. Our links are on our Facebook page. I'm sure we're going to get more refined and kind of spreading that. I know we're marketing pretty hard across the nation. So I'd love to bring some educators from all over the place into this. And we'll be doing these every Tuesday, Thursday, 9:30 to 10:30. Feel free to bring questions. We love to get off topic and answer things that we weren't planning on talking about. Keeps us on our toes. And just remember, like I said, it's not a matter of if ABA is coming to school, just kind of when. But I agree with what Ted said at the very beginning. It's already there. And we just need to refine it. We need to make it, we need to continue to grow in what we're already doing in the classrooms and focusing. So great job talking about data, Cammie. You get like extra.
Hey, she's got data. I love that. She's like, I got it.
We can make a whole session on that. Feel free to bring anything and everything that you want to talk about. And, my goal is that we end up getting some like really cool sponsor. That would be really fun. If we had to like take a midway break and say,
Nike. No, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. I don't think Nike.
Marlboro.
Or Skittles. I mean, we talk enough about Skittles on these things that we really should.
Yeah, or like Chips Ahoy or something. Yeah.
Yeah. We should.
Gummy fruit snacks. Oh, fruit snacks would be the best sponsor.
Yeah, we should get some kickback from these people, I think. And we're gonna, as we proceed, we'll talk about a bunch of different topics. Again, this is more informal than what our webinars were, but spread the word, guys. We hope to see you Thursday at 9:30. The link will always be the same. It's never going to change. It's never ending.
Never ending.
Yeah. Well, eventually Ted will get to like 90, 100 years old, and then it might end. I don't know. Even then, we might do a little
Ouija board. That's going to be in the future, and I think
stay on.
Then, I'll be dead from here down, so I'll be like a head in a pan.
Correct.
Yeah, in the future.
Science. Yeah.
Science is cool. Yeah. So, Cammie, we welcome to talk about her for an hour. We'd love to have just kind of one thing to focus our discussion on. So that would be great. All right, everybody. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll see you next week, Thursday at 9:30, and we'll see you then. Bye.
Bye, guys.
Love you guys.
Love you.